Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. After 15 months of war, Israel and Hamas have agreed to a ceasefire and hostage deal. The agreement has apparently been on the table for months. And even now, as the hostages are being released and Gazans return to their own homes, there are major questions about whether it will hold. We're joined by the veteran Israeli peace advocate and a Political Tours regular expert, Gershon Baskin. Hello, Gershon.
Hello, Nicholas, and everyone else.
Yeah, great to have you with us. I know you've been very, very busy. You have been a sort of lone voice really pushing for a deal for a very long time, and you've managed to get, I'm very glad to hear, a lot of attention around the world because of this. So we'll talk about that and your efforts in just a bit. But before we do that, just tell us about the agreement itself. What does it lay out?
So the agreement is a three-phased agreement, with the first 42 days or 6 weeks being rolled out now. The first day of ceasefire, Israel withdrew from populated areas in Gaza, started to withdraw from populated areas of Gaza, while Hamas released the first three civilian women hostages, three young women, two in their 20s, one in her early 30s. Two of them were taken from a kibbutz alongside the Gaza Strip. One was taken from the Nova Music Festival. In exchange, Israel released Palestinian prisoners, women and children, most of them administrative detainees, meaning that they were never actually tried and convicted, but they were held under administrative detention. During the first 42 days, 33 Israeli hostages are to be released. The next release will be on Saturday. 4 women hostages will be released. And then every Saturday throughout the 6-week period, there's supposed to be a release of hostages totaling a number of 33. Not all of them are alive. We don't know how many of them are alive. Hamas probably doesn't know how many of them are alive, and they're supposed to supply a list with the condition of the 33 hostages over the next 2 weeks, I believe. On day 16th of this 6-week period, 42 days, negotiations will begin on phase 2, which are supposed to be completed by day 30. During the first 42 days, Israel will be releasing close to 2,000 Palestinian prisoners, including prisoners who are serving life sentences. They figured out what they call a key for how many Palestinian prisoners and how long they've been serving prison terms based on the nature of the hostages released, with men, soldiers, requiring the largest number of prisoners released, including the largest number of life sentences. Most of the life sentence prisoners who will be released will be deported from Palestine, probably to Qatar or Turkey. Maybe some other countries might be included. The second phase of 42 days is supposed to bring about a release of the remaining hostages, whose number is 94, and a large number of Palestinian prisoners, as yet undecided. It is supposed to lead to a complete end of hostilities, a complete withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza, and a return to the international border. What is not determined is a timetable, the exact agreement of Israel and Hamas to end the war. There is no decision in there about the day after who will control Gaza. But phase 2 does include, phase 1 includes a massive increase of humanitarian aid, 600 trucks of humanitarian aid a day, with 300 of them going to the north of the Gaza Strip. Included in the 600 trucks is 50 trucks of fuel, which are headed for hospitals, bakeries, and the power station, which has been completely down during these last months. In phase, and it's supposed to allow for the entrance of temporary housing, caravans, and a few 100,000 tents, which will continue into phase 2. Phase 3 is supposed to be the beginning of reconstruction.
I've got many questions here, and I guess many questions about how you think it's going to work out. Do you think it's going to succeed? A question about the phases, also about where the hostages are. But my first question is, why is this happening now? This deal was there ostensibly on the table back in May.
Right. President Biden presented it at the end of May. By the beginning of July, I think July 2nd, Hamas announced that they agreed to it. And then Hamas claimed that Israel was adding all kinds of additional conditions to the deal, effectively changing the deal. And Israel claimed that Hamas was adding its own additions. They're both lying. The deal was there since the end of May. The deal that was signed at the end of the day is more or less what was there in May, perhaps with a few modifications. But the reason why it was done now was because of Donald Trump. Trump told Netanyahu that he wanted the deal done before he entered the Oval Office. 3 weeks ago, I met with one of the three heads of the Israeli negotiations who told me in a private meeting in his office that there would be a deal in 3 weeks. And I looked at the calendar, 3 weeks was January 20th. Steve Witkoff, the Middle East emissary of Donald Trump, who's a New York Jewish businessman, real estate mogul like Trump himself, is very transactional, just like Trump himself. He is a person who has very big investments in Qatar and in the United Arab Emirates. He doesn't have that many investments in Israel. He sees a much bigger picture. He, in fact, yesterday at the time of the inauguration, said that he plans to come back to Israel and to Gaza to see that this deal is implemented. So there seems to be a determination by Trump, who said both on election night and yesterday that he intends to end wars and not make new wars. This is remarkable for me to say anything positive about Donald Trump. Before the elections, I was on American radio stations saying this man is the most dangerous person in the world. He might be. We don't really know. He's completely unpredictable. But he seems intent on getting a Nobel Peace Prize. And from my point of view, as someone who lives here in Israel and has been working on Israeli-Palestinian peace for decades, if Donald Trump can do it, give him 10 Nobel Peace Prizes.
Right. The hostages themselves, I mean, I guess I'm going to make 2 points here. One is that many of them have been killed. We know 46,000 Palestinians dead, and actually possibly 10,000 more left underneath the rubble. We know that the hostages themselves spread out through Gaza, not just held by Hamas, held by other groups. And that's partly why Hamas doesn't know where all of them are. But the numbers, clearly, with all that destruction, many of them are dead.
Probably. There are very likely hostages who will never be recovered because they're buried underneath the rubble of buildings that were bombed or bulldozed by Israel, along with thousands of Palestinians from Gaza who are designated as missing. I understand today from some Telegram pieces that I read from Hamas Telegram account that they are beginning to search for bodies underneath rubble of buildings where they had no access to before. You're right that hostages are being held by other groups, Islamic Jihad primarily, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine are two groups that we know that are holding hostages. The first hostage that was rescued by Israel many months ago was actually held by a civilian, someone who had gone into Israel to one of the kibbutzim and abducted a young woman and actually kept her as a concubine. And she only got rescued because he went out to buy some food and she convinced him to leave her phone. She could play with games, and she took the phone and called Israel, and they came and rescued her. Wow. They killed him also in the process, but she was rescued. So we don't know where all the hostages are. Hamas doesn't know where all the hostages are. Hamas has no means of electronic communication. They haven't used any kind of telephones. And they did, in the negotiations, call representatives of the Popular Front and the Islamic Jihad to come to Doha before they finally agreed on the deal, to consult with them and have their agreement. And those two political bodies within the Palestinian politics agreed to the deal and presumably undertake the responsibility of finding hostages as well. As I said, I think within 2 weeks, Hamas is required to provide to the mediators, to Qatar and Egypt, a list of all 33 of the hostages and what their condition is. We still don't know the other 64 who will be left beyond this deal.
How could it go wrong? It's a plan in phases. Obviously, that raises questions. And then we obviously need to talk about Netanyahu's own motivations and his coalition. But let's just deal with the phases question first.
Right. There's so many ways that this could go wrong. I mean, it could be from simply Hamas not delivering the hostages, when they're supposed to. They already tried to delay. Yesterday, they announced that instead of releasing 4 hostages on Saturday, it would be on Sunday. Israel immediately protested to the Qataris and the Egyptians, and last night, Hamas put out an announcement that they would be released on Saturday. Israel and Hamas are both going to stick to the letter of the agreement and not allow either side to violate it, even though there'll probably be testing by both sides to see how much flexibility there is in the implementation of the agreement. It could be derailed by an armed encounter between Israeli soldiers and Hamas fighters. We know that the Hamas fighters came out of the bunkers wearing uniforms and carrying guns, and they might try to transport weapons and rockets and prepare for the next round of battle. And there's no reason to expect that the Israeli soldiers who encounter them would not shoot to kill, or the other way around. So that can happen any day. What's happening now in the West Bank could bring about a derailment of the agreement. There were apparently tens of Palestinians killed last night in Jenin. There's an Israeli military operation going on in Jenin now and in other parts of the West Bank. Since the resignation of Itamar Ben-Gvir from the government, the settler violence in the West Bank has been stepped up. And last night there was a pogrom in a village conducted by Jewish terrorists that even led to the extreme situation that almost never happens, where 2 Israeli soldiers shot bullets at these rioting Jewish terrorists. Now there's an investigation. Of course, no one has been arrested by the Israeli side of these Jewish terrorists who went in. They burned down 3 homes and a number of vehicles, including a tractor. And we can expect more of that. And that could bring about a Hamas reaction in Gaza to respond by shooting rockets or breaking down the ceasefire as well. The fact that it's going on for so many weeks, this is a deal that's going to be implemented over 2 to 3 months, means that there are many, many opportunities, and phase 2 is not completely secured. Hamas understands that there is an obligation in phase 2 for this war to end and for Israel to withdraw totally from the Gaza Strip. The Israeli prime minister has already told members of his government that Israel is not ending the war, that it could renew the war at any time, and there's no intention of the Israeli military to withdraw entirely from Gaza. They have set up a perimeter around the entire borders of Israel-Gaza where they intend to stay. Another aspect of the deal that's expected is that once this is all over, the siege on Gaza will end, and people in Gaza will once again have some sort of free movement in and out for people and goods. And that's also part of the understandings that's unlikely to be implemented by the current Israeli government.
I mean, you've indicated quite clearly from the fact that Trump was so able to put pressure on Netanyahu and force him to deliver. That's why Netanyahu's given in, but clearly not a very happy participant. What are his interests in terms of? I mean, he's got his own coalition partners. One of Bloc has already pulled out of a coalition, leaving the majority just 2 in Parliament. The other partner could pull out 2, and you'd have a collapse of government. So where do his interests lie?
Well, first of all, Ben-Gvir withdrew from the government because he was opposed to the deal. Smotrich is also opposed to the deal, but he stayed in the government. Ben-Gvir said he will continue to vote with the coalition, even though they're not part of the coalition officially anymore. So I think Netanyahu's majority in the parliament is still secure. But certainly Netanyahu's refusal to enter into any kind of deal like this was because of Hamas' insistence that any deal lead to the end of the war. And Netanyahu simply said he's not willing to end the war. And that's because his own political survival is based on keeping the war going. While the war is going, he can block the demand of the Israeli people to go to new elections. The majority of Israelis don't want Netanyahu in government anymore and hold him responsible for the failure of Israel to protect itself last October 7th. Very few Israelis actually come to the conclusion that Netanyahu's strategy of preventing any kind of resolution with the Palestinian people is what led to October 7th. They also don't come to the conclusion that the reason why Israel wasn't on the border with Gaza on October 7th is because they were protecting settlers in the West Bank for many years already, rather than being an army which protects the borders. They were protecting settlers. But that will come out. The other reason is Netanyahu doesn't want the creation of a national commission of inquiry headed appointed by an independent Supreme Court judge that would determine what happened, what led to October 7th, what happened on October 7th, who's responsible for that. And there's no way that Netanyahu is the head of this government, the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history, that he could escape direct responsibility for what happened. And for the dysfunctional nature of his government since October 7th. So he's trying to deflect that all along, and the best way to deflect it is keeping the war going, keeping the troops enlisted, keeping the reservists on duty and not home to protest and to go to the streets and demand a change.
So I think the best thing, everyone, if you must get your questions in early to Gershon. The talk will be about 40 minutes, so we've got about another 25 minutes to go. But please, wherever you are on the world, be it in Texas, New York, Sydney, wherever, it's quite late in Sydney, I think, do put your questions in straight away. Just raise your hand. You could put something in the chat box, or the best thing is the Q&A. So do put your questions in there straight away. There are so many questions here to ask. We could talk about what happens in Gaza, the rebuilding of it, but it almost seems too soon with this sort of uncertain nature of things. Is there other reasons why Netanyahu may be tempted to see this deal through? Because there could be things that he could gain as well. Obviously, he's getting kudos from the hostages being released at the moment. If that continues, surely he does well out of that.
Yeah, but even those hostages that, we've had 3 women come back, and it was one of the most emotional days in Israel's history that I remember, watching these 3 young women being retrieved from Gaza and coming back home to greet their mothers after 471 days in Hamas captivity, and that they were standing and walking and seemed to be relatively in good situation was remarkable. One of the women lost 2 of her fingers, and her hand symbol has now become a mime that's being spread all over the world as a symbol of strength and resistance, a remarkable young woman. But Netanyahu, he spiked in the polls when Israel had its military successes of killing Nasrallah, of dismantling, to a large extent, the ability of Hezbollah to fight in Lebanon, reaching a ceasefire there. Certainly killing Yahya Sinwar and the Hamas leadership in Gaza has brought about successes for Netanyahu, but his growth in public opinion is only within the bounds of the coalition. He still hasn't shown that he could, if there were new elections, that he could form a new government. There are thoughts that perhaps he has some kind of secret agreement with Trump in the line of allowing new settlements to be built, or even annexation of parts of the West Bank. I tend to doubt it, simply because it seems to me that Trump's priority is much more Saudi Arabia than Israel and Palestine. And the Saudis have never been more intent on using their power to see that the Palestinians get a state. In the past, it was often thought that it was Saudi lip service. Many Israelis perceive, I believe incorrectly, that the Saudis, the biggest interest of Saudi Arabia is in fighting Iran, and they would be willing to go with the United States and Israel in doing that. But I think this is once again a misperception from the side of Israel and perhaps the fundamentalist Christians in America who don't understand what's really happening. Because for a year now, the Saudis and the Emiratis, who fought against Iran militarily, decided that that was not the approach they were taking. And they are in the process of diplomatic reconciliation with Iran, with the hopes that that would lead to a dismantlement of Iran's intentions, if they exist, to create a nuclear bomb. The Saudis and the Emiratis are not planning to attack Iran, even if the United States joins Israel to do it. They would be the front line of the attacks by Iran to their economic wealth, whether it be what we saw in the past, Iranian rockets to Saudi gas fields, oil fields, or imagine one rocket hitting downtown Dubai. You'll have an immediate fleeing of the hundreds of thousands of expatriates who are living there, who built a dynamic economic superpower out of the Arab Emirates, diversifying it from oil and gas. So they're not in line with Israel. And I don't think Trump has any intention of putting American boots on the ground. That doesn't mean that Trump won't use the Air Force and the Navy to attack Iran. They could, but we don't know. In the meantime, it seems to me that the agreement that Trump has given to the Qataris and the Egyptians was to tell Hamas that he will ensure that the war in Gaza will end. This is my assessment. I could be wrong. I mean, maybe this is just my wishful thinking. Trump, as I said, is completely unpredictable, and he has no moral compass. So his politics will not be based on any kind of morality that we understand. It'll be completely transactional and whatever is best for Donald Trump.
I'd love to get those questions, everyone. Do put them down in the Q&A box. This brings me on to the question about sort of Palestinian leadership. I mean, everyone's very clear. Hamas cannot be allowed to rule in Gaza again. Yet it's very popular in the West Bank. And the idea of the PA coming into Gaza and running things seems incredible.
No, look, the PA has zero legitimacy. Mahmoud Abbas is 90 years old. He's in the 19th year of a 4-year term. He's running an autocratic, corrupt regime that has zero legitimacy in all of Palestine, West Bank and Gaza, East Jerusalem, and in the Palestinian diaspora. He has a group of cronies around him who support him, but he has no support. His prime minister, Mohammed Mustafa, is a decent guy. He's an economist. He ran the Palestine Investment Fund, but he is quite frankly seen as a clerk in the office of Mahmoud Abbas, not really independent. He put forth a whole program of reforms of the Palestinian Authority, but he can't implement them because Abbas won't let him. The Palestinians want Abbas gone. The most popular Palestinian figure is, of course, Marwan Barghouti, who's 22 years in Israeli prison. He might be released in this deal. The Israelis are saying that they won't release him, but I wouldn't say that that is a conclusion that we should necessarily release. But if Marwan Barghouti is released, he won't be released to the West Bank. He'll be deported. And I understand there have been talks with the Arab Emirates about him going to the UAE, perhaps Abu Dhabi, where Mohammed Dakhlan is also resident. The Palestinians need new leadership. The Emiratis themselves would like to see Abbas appoint a new prime minister who's legitimate and not corrupt, and then step aside and be president for life with ceremonial responsibilities and not real power. I don't know how likely that is to happen. There's a better chance that Abbas could appoint someone to govern Gaza for a period of 2 to 3 years and create an independent government in Gaza, linked organically to the Palestinian Authority, because that's the only legal way of establishing it. The Egyptians have put a plan forward like that, but Abbas and Fatah vetoed it. So it's difficult to know what's going to happen. What is very clear is that Hamas has very little power and support in Gaza today. The Gazans don't want Hamas. They hold Hamas responsible for the disaster that's befallen on them. Of course, they blame Israel. Israel did all the bombing, but they see Hamas as being responsible for that, and they don't want Hamas anymore. That doesn't mean Hamas is going to go anywhere. 2 days ago, when the ceasefire began, Hamas executed some people who were in the opposition to them in the streets for people to see. So it's not like a free democratic society where people can gather and protest and push Hamas out. Hamas holds the guns and they hold the power, even if they've been badly dismantled. There is one Palestinian person that I know personally who is originally from Gaza. He has the credentials. He's a diplomat and a politician who supports the two-state solution as opposed to violence and thinks that the armed struggle for Palestine is finished, should have been finished a long time ago. That's Dr. Nasser al-Qudwa. Nasser was the PLO ambassador in the United Nations for 17 years. He served as a deputy secretary general of the United Nations. In 2021, he headed a political party that was supposed to participate in the elections that Abbas canceled, a list that was jointly supported by Marwan Barghouti. In fact, Marwan's wife, Fadwa, was number 2 on his list. And as a result of putting forth an independent list that challenged Fatah, Abbas kicked Nasser al-Qudwa out of Fatah, the Central Committee, from being president of the Yasser Arafat Foundation, and he's in exile living in France outside of Nice. His wife was French. Nasser al-Qudwa is also the nephew of Yasser Arafat. Nasser's mother was Arafat's sister, which gives him a great deal of legitimacy on the streets. And my Palestinian colleague Samer Sinjalawi and I brought Nasser al-Qudwa together with former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, and they together, with our help, negotiated a vision for the future, which includes ending the war, the two-state solution based on the 67 borders, a solution for Jerusalem. And we've presented that over the last 4 months with Olmert and Nasser Kidwa to about 35 foreign ministers in the region and in Europe mostly.
Yeah.
And they authored a joint piece that was published.
Let's bring Diane Cook's got a question which sort of comes in on this. So Diane, ask your question, and we're going to rattle through these quickly because now the questions are flowing in, and we'll keep the answers short. So Diane, ask your question.
Well, good to see you, Gershon, and thank you for your time. With approximately the same number of Jews and Palestinians in a very small space in the Middle East, what do you detect the mood in each group for actually having an enduring solution? So you use this dreadful war as a chance to say, you know, can we get together in some way or other, whether that's the two-state solution or or whatever?
Yeah,
right.
Okay, so let's do these quickly because I've got lots coming through now.
Okay, there are 7 million Israeli Jews and 7 million Palestinian Arabs living between the river and the sea. And there's no question that this has to be the last time we do this. We can't keep killing each other. Unfortunately, the mood on both sides is a disbelief in the possibilities of peace, while a majority of Israelis and a majority of Palestinians will say, I want peace, but there's no one on the other side to make peace with. And this is where we have the lack of trust that exists as a result of 30 years of failed peacemaking. What needs to happen is a new generation of leaders who stand up and say, I want peace, and they need to convince people on the other side that they are intent and willing to make peace. And this is why one of the things that my Palestinian colleagues and I are working on are building partnerships between prominent Israelis and Palestinians to stand up and say, yes, we want peace, and this is the solution. There is only a two-state solution. There is no one-state solution. Israelis and Palestinians haven't been killing each other to live in the United States of Israel, Palestine. They all want a nation state of their own, a place that gives a territorial representation of their identity. And surprisingly, the two-state solution is back on the table. The Saudis initiated in September the Global Alliance for the Implementation of the Two-State Solution, and now held their 4th meeting last week in Oslo with the participation of 90 countries. Of course, Israel was invited. They weren't there. The Palestinian Authority was represented there.
I've got to say, I've never been I've been a two-stater for a very long time. I can't see, if you've got masses of settlements across the West Bank and no desire.
There are solutions for that, Nicholas. The Nasser al-Kidwa Olmert plan takes into account 80% of the settlements with an annexation of 4.4% of the West Bank in exchange for equal territory in Israel. You deal with 80% of them immediately with the acceptance of the maps that have already been prepared for doing that. The remaining 20%, there are also ways of dealing with it.
That's a big if, that one, uprooting those settlements.
The whole thing is a big if.
Yeah.
The whole thing is a big if, but the big if is answered by we have no other choice.
Yeah. Great. Next one, Richard Burrows. Richard, microphone, probably on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. You just need to open it up. There you go.
Got it? Okay. Hi, Gershon. Richard here. Good to see you, even at a distance. We're in Washington right now. We watched the inauguration yesterday. And we see the capital that Mr. Trump has gained by effectively claiming credit for the ceasefire. But will he have a continuing interest? I mean, your account of the risks to the rollout of the different stages of this thing suggests that Big Brother needs to be in attendance. Will he, do you think?
Steve Witkoff, his emissary, has said that he's coming back to the region. He's even talking about purchasing a flat in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem and being here for extended period of time. He already announced that he's planning to go to Gaza. He wants to see this implemented. He will be back and forth to Doha and to Cairo. And I think we will see a bigger commitment with a more realistic outlook from Stephen Witkoff than we saw from Brett McGurk, who was negotiating this thing since May, the assistant to President Biden, who I can tell you in September, I got Hamas's agreement to do a deal in 3 weeks that would end the war withdraw Israeli troops, do an exchange of prisoners and hostages. And the Hamas leadership agreed to it in writing. And Brett McGurk was so invested in the failed negotiations that he was running that he wouldn't even consider anything else. And that was the response of the Egyptians and the Qataris, who I met with. I was invited to Qatar by the Qatari government and met with their negotiators. And they told me the Americans are just pushing this deal that Biden put on the table in May and wouldn't consider anything else. So I think that we're going to see a commitment from Witkoff and Trump to see this deal through. Are there secret agreements between Trump and the Israelis? We don't know. You know, the settler movement was very present at the inauguration yesterday, and they had meetings with people in the new administration last night in Washington, and they have a very large voice within the Trump, the MAGA camp. Of the evangelical Christians and the extreme right wing of the Republican.
Let's bring in a question from Hookie Walker just about that. So Hookie, ask your question.
Yeah, I think actually your speaker is absolutely brilliant. He said everything that can be said. Nevertheless, I'll ask this question about Trump's motivation. You might have thought, on the basis of his record last time, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and so forth, that he was going to give Netanyahu his head this time. How is it that he's now turned round, as it would seem, to force through a deal, and yet appoints as his ambassador to Tel Aviv an evangelical Christian who believes that Israel is God-given by God? It's all a bit mystifying to me.
Yeah, and that ambassador has called for the continuation of the war in Gaza.
Right. That ambassador says there's no such thing as a Palestinian people, and there are no settlements, there Israeli communities, and there's no West Bank, there's only Judea and Samaria. But I like to remind people that he has an ambassador with quite clear political positions, but he is not a decision maker in the Trump administration. He's a clerk. He follows policy. And I think we might even see policies that he will say, I cannot implement, and therefore I will resign. We will see. We don't know. We really don't know. Trump is completely unpredictable. As I said, he's transactional, and he seems to be saying that he sees a bigger picture here. His 2020 plan, his vision for the future, actually included a Palestinian state. Although it wasn't much of a state, they didn't have much sovereignty, they didn't have control of their borders. But the principle of a Palestinian state was in the original Trump vision. It allowed for Israel to annex 30% of the West Bank, which is, of course, a non-starter. But my Palestinian colleague and I, Samer, wrote a piece that was published in I don't remember where it was published, maybe the Washington Post, which suggested that if Trump were to put down his plan today as stage one, as the point where negotiations begin, then perhaps we could see real progress, because there you have the principle of Palestinian statehood next to Israel, and then you need to negotiate borders and contiguity and things like that. Also, I'll remind everyone that when he did move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, he moved it to West Jerusalem, and he said that the final status and final borders of Jerusalem needed to be determined in negotiations. Some people think that he recognized the Israeli annexation over East Jerusalem, which was done in 1967. That's not the case. He did recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and that's simply recognizing the reality. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. But that doesn't mean that all of Jerusalem, or all of the Jerusalem defined by Israel, is the capital of Israel. That was not recognized by the United States.
Okay, I do want you to state some of the obvious, and that's just what's life like in Gaza now? I mean, we see the pictures. Indeed, we know people who've had every aspect of their life entirely destroyed. It's very difficult to think how 2 million people, 2.2 million people, are going to get their lives back together.
Yeah, they're not. There needs to be rapid reconstruction, the immediate entry of temporary housing, of facilities that can be done. Population needs to be concentrated in areas so that infrastructure can be. There's no infrastructure. There are no roads. There's no electricity. There's no water systems. There are no schools. There are no universities. There are no public buildings, courts. Mosques have been knocked down. 2 million people are homeless and have no homes to go back to. This is a human tragedy. And now we have facing disease and famine and poisoning from unpolluted water and no sewage being treated. It's a disaster. It is a human disaster. The Israelis don't see any of this, by the way. What we see on Israeli television is some of the physical damage. We see none of the human suffering.
I have to say also, I think on Western television, where it's slightly, we don't get the coverage, you certainly don't get the personal stories, and we don't have Western reporters, we don't have our own network reporters in Gaza, so you're not actually hearing this. It's very, I think people have got used to tens of thousands of people getting blown up.
I think we're going to very soon be seeing Western reporters going into Gaza, because now Israel is withdrawn from most of the population centers, and they will be freer to move around, and we'll see them entering through the Egyptian border.
Yeah. Alan Livingston, question from Texas.
Yes, Gershon, good morning. We hope to see you here in Houston on your forthcoming trip to the United States. We're still working on trying to make some arrangements here. But I have two questions. Number one, will the Gulf states come in at this time and help pay for the reconstruction of Gaza? Or are they waiting for some kind of word or something like that to happen with Saudi Arabia and some of the other negotiations? And secondly, if an election were held in Israel today, who would be the leading candidate to replace Netanyahu?
Okay, so first, there won't be any money going to Gaza for reconstruction if Hamas is continuing to control Gaza. The Emirates are quite clear and they provided 30% of the humanitarian aid into Gaza since the beginning of the war. The Emiratis have said that as soon as the war is over, if there is not a Palestinian government, which is not run by Mahmoud Abbas, they will not contribute a penny to the reconstruction of Gaza. They're very clear. They want a new Palestinian prime minister who has power and not Abbas. They might be willing to consider an appointed Palestinian prime minister or head of government for Gaza and not for the whole Palestinian Authority, but their preference is for a renewed Palestinian Authority. I think that the other Gulf states, including Qatar, are not willing to put money into reconstruction in Gaza if they think that it might be destroyed again. They want to know that this is going to be the last time this happens. Qatar will continue if they're allowed to provide humanitarian aid, but I don't think that even Qatar will participate in the reconstruction, and neither will the Saudis. So that's a condition. I know that these Arab countries would be willing to send peacekeepers, some kind of military force to Gaza if invited by a legitimate Palestinian government and coordinated with a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. And that's something that a new Palestinian government in Gaza would need to do. With regard to elections in Israel, well, what we know is that Netanyahu can't win. He can't put together a majority government. It's not clear who would win from the opposition or who's worthy of winning. We saw for the first time last week Gadi Eisenkot, former chief of staff and number 2 in Gantz's party of the I forgot what they're called in English, the National something or other. Gadi Eisenkot has called for primaries in that party, suggesting that he actually may want to replace Gantz as the head of the party. And that would be very good because, Gantz's son and 2 of his nephews were killed in this war. And even though he was chief of staff and spent 40 years of his life in the army, he's much more intelligent than Gantz, and he has a much clearer moral code than Gantz does. I think someone with a lot more integrity. When Gantz first entered politics, his first political campaign in presenting himself to the public was, I killed more Arabs than all the others. And that's certainly not the kind of leader I want to see in Israel. But Gantz is someone who might be more acceptable. He has never spoken out clearly on his support of peace of any kind, but he is seemingly much more moderate than anyone else in that party. And that's the party that's leading right now, so probably the head of that party. But I think that once elections are called, we'll see a remaking of the political map in Israel. There'll be all kinds of new groupings, new political parties and new groupings, so it's very difficult to predict.
We've got a very concrete question here, and then I think we'll wrap things up shortly. Imagine that if you're a young Palestinian engineer or architect, or let's say a radiologist, and you might be in Ramallah, or let's say you're in Nablus or Jenin. What's your future? What are your prospects? What are your likelihood of, what kind of employment do you have? What kind of future can you have? And what kind of state can you rely on to get that employment?
Right. Well, I would say the number one priority of that those people in that class that you described is to get a visa to go somewhere else. That's where people are looking. Anyone who can get out and get a job and have a right to live in some other country, young Palestinians, that's what they're looking at. They don't see a future for themselves under the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah with the Israeli occupation, or certainly not in Gaza. And that's very sad. If things were to change politically, we would see a rededication of young Palestinians to being part of the project of building their state. That unfortunately has not been the reality for many years. You can survive in the West Bank much more than you can in Gaza, but the West Bank economy is dependent on Israel. And since the war, some 200,000 Palestinians who made their livelihood in Israel have not been able to work in Israel. That needs to change again. They need to be allowed to work in Israel, not because working in Israel is the dream of anyone, but you make 4 or 5 times the salary in working in Israel than you can working in the West Bank. Simply the reality of economics.
Yeah.
So
and then a follow-up to that question to that is from Richard Murphy, who's on a ferry between the Isle of Wight and Southampton somewhere. And he said, can you just talk about the ordinary day-to-day lives of Palestinians and Israelis, particularly in education and health? And this is something that people really do see on our tours, the disconnect between these communities. Israelis who run the West Bank, controlled most aspects of Palestinian lives, really don't have much of an idea about what ordinary Palestinians think. We just had 2 members of the IDF on a recent tour, and they were asking me, what do Palestinians think? And I think that's just incredible. But can you, right. You've been on our tours, you know what happens. You spend a lot of time in the West Bank, and also you've been in Gaza. Just talk a bit about that disconnect, but also what possibly, if anything, people have in common.
Right. There's even a disconnect, Nicholas, within the West Bank itself between the Ramallah, Bethlehem bubble and the rest of the West Bank. Ramallah, a new shopping mall opened up in Ramallah 2 weeks ago. It's just unimaginable. This very fancy new shopping mall. But that's really a bubble. That's where the expatriates are. That's where the international money is. That's where many of the Palestinian Authority workers are. The rest of the West Bank is living in deep poverty now. People cannot bring food to their table. There's a sense of social solidarity, and people help each other, and people are trying to grow their own fruits and vegetables again, like they did many, many years ago. But it's really very much of a survival mood. The economy is broken. People are really struggling. I have friends who have small businesses who are deeply in debt and can't collect money. The Palestinian Authority is deeply in debt, and the Palestinian banks won't even loan money to the Palestinian Authority anymore. So daily life is very, very hard. It's much about survival, but life goes on. Life is stronger than anything else. People go to work where they have work. They go to school. The universities are open and working. Transportation is difficult. Someone told me there are 700 checkpoints in the West Bank now. Basically, if you travel from one town to another, you're going to spend a lot of time in a car or in a taxi waiting to get from one place to another. It's a disaster. It's really hard.
Whereas if you're in a settlement, you've got a lovely highway taking you straight into Jerusalem in a matter of minutes.
Right. Well, not a matter of minutes. Traffic in Israel is horrible. I hardly ever use my car anymore because
you know what I mean.
It's so terrible. Yeah, but as compared to Palestinians, certainly it's day and night. Life in Israel this past 15 months has been very hard and very sad. This has been a very, very sad country. The other night, with the return of the 3 hostages, was the first time in 15 months, since November, actually, of last year, when the first hostages came home. It was the first time in many, many months where I saw people smiling, people happy. We were crying with joy. I mean, there wasn't a dry eye in the country when we saw those 3 young women come home. But it's very frustrating. It's very frightening. You know, people all over the country have had to use their bomb shelters. My bomb shelter is right behind me, that white door, which I close when I'm doing Zooms.
And everyone knows someone who was killed or who was taken. It's such a place.
For sure. We all do know people. And so many of the reservists have been in reserve duty for 200 days, for 300 days. And the economy is stagnant. And finally, airlines are beginning to come back to fly here because it's been really difficult to fly in and out of Israel. Very difficult and very expensive. As most foreign airlines, we've become an island once again. That's beginning to change. Yeah. But it has not been a happy country at all.
Yeah, well, I'm very hopeful. I am hopeful that we can come back sometime this year, if possible. We'll just have to see things go. We certainly want to know a lot more about it. But it's I think, a horrendous time for most people on both sides. Gershon, thank you very much indeed for your time and your insight. It's been really, really good, and we hope to see you again in person soon.
Hope so too. Thank you.